Hello.
Hey, what's up, bud?
Nothing. I said you were the one who said you wanted to talk about something. So, what exactly is the contention that you had with what I had
Um,
said?
oh, I didn't have any. I didn't think you even said something for me to have a contention with. You said you had a spicy take on the.
Oh, I just think I think all I don't know if my take is spicy necessarily. I just think that all of the people who are saying stuff on the topic of like the whole Destiny Vosh what is it, a perspective philosophy REM situation. I think all of them are wrong to some degree. I think that I it, so perspective philosophy said something really interesting to me is
Mhm,
that he doesn't like to think of ethics like from a godlike perspective, like from the perspective of a really zoomed out individual.
mhm,
And I think I fundamentally disagree with that because that's the only way I see ethics is from the very zoomed out perspective.
mhm,
I almost never think of things in terms of uh individual cases because I don't think that's very useful. I think it's way better to look at broader systems.
mhm.
But at the same time, I think that Vosh's metaphysics is terrible, and I don't understand how he believes what he believes. Like it's, I feel like he needs to engage a little bit with what they are saying because if he did, he would be able to argue with them better than he does because he you can't take an anti-realist position about everything. Like I can understand it with morals to an extent,
Mhm.
but you can't take it about truth as well. That's not possible.
I would disagree there. I
You think
think. Well, so I wouldn't take an anti-realist position either on either of those two questions, depending, of course, on how you define an anti-realist position. But I think that if you take an anti-realist position on morality, you almost necessarily have to take a anti-realist position uh, on epistemology. Um,
is this companions in guilt? Because I don't think I agree with companions in
More or
guilt.
less. I mean, like it just. I feel like whether or not if I say my system of truth is defined as what conforms to reality, and you say your system of truth is whatever is true is what conforms to what makes you feel good. And, maybe you think that saying the sky is red makes you feel better than saying the sky is blue, and therefore that's true by your system. I feel like at the end of the day, the only way you can say what system of truth we should go by is almost by some sort of a normative moral preference.
I don't think that's true because I think that the way companions in guilt was explained to me, I
Mm-hmm.
don't find it very convincing. I think that you can deny normative realism without leading to any contradiction, and you can't deny epistemic realism without leading to contradictions fundamentally in logic. Like you can't. The thing is that you can't have an anti-realist position about truth because if you do, it's like the 101 philosophy thing where if you say there is no objective truth, well then that statement is itself a universe meant to be a universal truth about the universe. So it undermines itself, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like
So
if there's no reason to believe anything, then there's no reason to believe the epistemic anti-realist.
yeah, that's companions in guilt.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is that normative I don't think that normative claims are necessarily the same. I I'm a little bit I go back and forth on moral realism all the time because I find it very hard to get from the moral realist perspective to applied ethics. Like
Mm-hmm.
I've never seen anybody successfully bridge that gap. And maybe that's just because I've only ever seen like REM go really hard on it and REM is insufferable and
Sure.
not very articulate.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
But,
for sure.
you know, it's uh, it's hard. Like I tried to talk to the other guy, Marty, about this, and
Mm-hmm.
Marty is much less insufferable and also much more educated than Rem.
Mm-hmm.
And he, I think, I think he took an even more realist position than you did, because what he said is that actually you might have just spouted off his position. He
Okay.
said that like you can't separate factual claims from normative claims, because whenever you make a factual claim, you are necessarily using normative reasons to choose certain factual claims over others.
Yeah, well, okay,
And
so like that's sort of my problem is like you say that you can you say that like you almost seem to be separating like descriptive claims and normative claims. But it seems to me that if you okay, so like say you make any factual statement. So like I'm live streaming right now. That factual statement is always like whether or not that statement is true is going to appeal to some system of determining what truth is. And so like the system of truth might be what is true is what conforms to reality. But I could say, well, my system is true. My system of truth is I just determine, I flip a coin and I say whatever is true is like whatever I say is going to happen if I land on heads, right? And the only way of determining, well, no, I think we should have this system of truth over my system of truth is by making some normative preferential appeal. Like I normatively prefer this system of truth. We ought to pick this system of truth because of, reasons, which seems ultimately to be like a normative choice.
I don't think that's true though, because
Mm-hmm.
your example of the coin flipping can lead to contradiction. That has the potential to create contradiction and thus undermine itself. And I don't think that that's just normative preference. I think that that makes the system incoherent.
Well, ultimately, you have to have a sort of normative preference of I prefer not being incoherent, right?
I deny that this is a normative preference. I think it's just it's just necessary. Like you can't not experience it like that.
Mm,
Like you can't refute the laws of logic without leading to contradiction, which is why we see them as being universal a priori knowledge, right?
mm-hmm,
Like because you can't refute them, we say that these must be facts of the universe to some degree.
mm,
And and I think that like regardless, you can't get around that with a normative preference, because everybody is fundamentally processes stuff that way.
mm-hmm,
You can't not process things in such a way that um such that it like violates non-contradiction or violates causality or whatever
mm.
else, right? You can't it's fundamentally impossible for you to do that. So I don't think that if you want to call that normative, I guess you can, but I think I disagree that that's normative, because that just seems factual to me. Like that doesn't seem to imply a preference at all. That just follows from the premises.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this almost seems like an is-ought problem, right? Like you can say like, well, it's impossible to perceive reality not in this way, or to approach reality in a way that doesn't appeal to one of these sort of epistemic axioms. But at the end of the day, I would still consider the ought statement of like abiding by those to be a sort of normative preference. Um,
Well,
but I
but
don't know. It almost seems like a semantic thing. So I'm not sure.
couldn't I just use ought implies can, and that would be the same exact thing? Like to say that you ought it would be impossible to say that you ought to act in ways such that it creates illogical outcomes, because that implies it can be the case,
Mm-hmm.
and it can't be the case. Therefore, it makes no sense to have it be an ought claim. in the first place?
Mm, maybe. Yeah,
I
maybe.
guess you would need to agree with ought implies can, but
Sure.
I've never really, I don't know, ought implies can just seems really, that just seems incorrect. Like, I don't know how you would get around ought implies can
Sure.
without fundamental contradictions
Hmm.
in moral systems. Like,
Mm.
how do you say that people ought to do things that aren't possible, right?
Mm.
That,
Yeah.
I don't know. That seems, that feels illogical to me, and I don't know if there's like a formalized proof for that or not, though. So
Hmm.
I'm not really sure.
Yeah.
For the topic of how this relates, though, is that
Hmm.
Vosh is not like this, though. Is that
Sure.
he denies even the base conception of objective truth, and I don't think you can do that. Like, and I don't think he, for some reason, does not listen to any arguments anyone has to say about it. And like he makes all these different analogies to like motion and stuff like
Hmm.
that, but ultimately it's still, I don't think that it's possible to deny objective truth the way he does, and I think that it makes his argument look way worse
Hmm.
than it would otherwise be. Because
Yeah.
like otherwise, I think I agree more with him than I do with other people.
Sure.
Like I think that I don't I don't really focus much on individual actions. I try to, a big part of my morality is also assuming that people don't really have the will to act in moral ways all the time, and
Hmm.
I usually do take the God's eye position that perspective philosophy says you shouldn't take, but I take that anyway because I feel like that's more conducive to actually creating good moral outcomes,
Hmm.
because nobody just listens to you. Nobody's going to be debated about their moral preferences. That doesn't seem to work out in reality.
Sure.
It seems to be more that people respond to certain incentives,
Hmm.
and if you create the right incentive structure, people will do things differently. And
Mm.
I think that that's a way more um useful way of looking at morality than individual assignments of right and wrong. Does that make
Sure.
sense?
Yeah.
And
Sure.
that's something that like REM and perspective philosophy like seem to really dislike. Like they
Hmm.
don't like that approach. They seem to care a lot more about the individual doing certain things and if that can be moral or immoral.
Mm.
I don't I don't know if I really like perspective philosophy's definition of socialism very much,
Mm.
because he said it would be socialist if you were a landlord but charged less than market rates.
Hmm.
Like that doesn't seem very socialist to me, like
Sure.
under any definition.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I
Sure.
don't
Sure.
know.
Yeah. So
That's just how I feel about it.
I guess I would say like with regards to fuck, this almost seems like so long ago I can like hardly remember it. With regards to like the companions and guilt thing, well, I agree that like I sort of agree with the ought implies can thing, but at the end of the day, it is possible to live in accordance with the idea, like I said, like you could come up with any sort of like system of truth where I could come up with like the truth is whatever I say, if I land on heads, that's true. um and it would be possible, right? Like you can live by that system of truth. um However, oh wait, hold on just a second.
Wouldn't it contradict itself though? Like if I said, like you could just say, a statement could be true or false at different times, and it would
Hmm.
be impossible for you to differentiate which one is actually correct, and that would be a self-undermining system. So because it's incoherent,
Sure,
it doesn't.
it would be possible to live by a system of truth that allows for contradiction.
What does live
But
by mean to you
sure, so
exactly?
like to so like to determine truth through this mechanism, I guess, in your like day-to-day life. Like it would be possible to sort of apply a system of truth where you are determining what's true based on these sorts of mechanisms, but you could say that it's highly counterintuitive to do so. But then to say that like the idea that we ought to adopt a system of truth that more closely aligns with our intuition, again, I would say that that's like almost a normative preference.
Okay. So I disagree that that would be truth at all,
Mhm.
because if it's undermining itself, then I think it's at that point definitionally not truth anymore. Because
But you're almost sort of question begging, right? Like you're assuming that this model of truth is wrong because it doesn't mesh with your model of truth.
so it is I guess you could say it is kind of question begging, but like if you want to get to that, all logic is question begging,
Sure.
because you can't justify the principles of logic within logic. But the thing is that the difference for that is that denying the principles of logic is impossible for us.
Mhm.
God, I don't know if you were there. Were you there when I made the analogy to computers? I feel like I
I
you must have
believe
been.
I was, yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll repeat it for the audience just in case, because I know that I'm in front of multiple people at this point. A whole, I don't know. There's probably like one viewer at least. Regardless, I hmm. basically one thing that my friend pointed out is that we can create machines with a more limited set of logical principles than us. So it's technically possible that there is some expanded set of logical principles that explain the logical principles we have, and that we just don't have access, like cognitively, to those principles outside of ourselves.
Hmm.
But the thing is that it's impossible for us to not live like this, in the same way that it's also not possible for us to perceive things atemporally, right? We necessarily perceive things in time, right? We
Hmm.
can't not do that.
Sure.
That's impossible. So I think it would not make any sense to then deny that, since it's fundamental to human existence. And I don't think that that's necessarily just normative preference. I think that since it's impossible to get around that, that has to be the basis for everything. Like
Um,
you cannot get
mhm.
around it, because if you it would be fundamentally denying the tools by which you even evaluate if something is true or not.
Mhm. Yeah.
Like if you have in order to be able to evaluate the truth or falsity or of something, it presupposes that you have some idea of what evidence you would need in order to prove that something would be true or false, right?
Mhm.
Like if you have you would never be able to know if something were true or false if you didn't have some idea in your head. And when it comes to like theories of truth about like the physical world and the world outside of our minds, that I think you can reasonably make the argument that there's subjectivity there and normativity, maybe.
Mhm.
But I don't think that you can make that argument for logic. I think that it's impossible to do it for logic. Does that make
Sure.
sense?
Yeah. I, I, I guess I agree with you that it's impossible to perceive the world in a way that contains contradictions. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it's necessarily impossible to adopt a system of truth which entails contradictions. Because if I were to do that, then you would say, okay, so you've adopted a system of truth that defies our intuition about things like the law of non contradiction. But then I would say, well, why can't I do that? And you would say, like, well, you just can't, like, sort of intuitively. But I would ultimately say that that in itself is appealing to a normative preference to not do that.
I think that there's a distinction here, because I don't think of it as an intuition.
Mhm.
Like you can be trained. Different people can have different intuitions, and different people can be trained out of their intuitions. But I don't think that it's possible to change our perspective in that same way. It's not possible for us to not perceive things in such a way that non-contradiction can't be violated, or that we can perceive things out of time,
Mm-hmm.
you know? Like if you've
Sure.
ever seen Arrival, we can't perceive things like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's universal to human experience. So I don't really like comparing it to an intuition because it's not possible for us to do anything else.
Yeah, I mean, we could use like different terminology. Like I could say it's not an intuition, it's just like I guess it's a fundamental aspect of reality that we sort of perceive, right? But I guess like so let's say like it is just a fact of our cognition that we cannot perceive contradiction or conceptualize sort of like contradiction
Yeah.
in reality. Um, I guess like I guess we can like move
Yeah.
on because it feels like we're just kind of like in a sense going in circles. But
Yeah. Yeah,
yeah, I
you
would just
can't
say like to
you
say
can't
like
in your mind picture a square
right,
circle. That's
yeah. Yeah,
impossible.
exactly, yeah. And I would just say like sure, so we have this sort of aspect of reality that's kind of built into our cognition. Um we could use like any term we want for it, but I would still say to make the claim that uh to make the claim that like therefore we have to construct a system of truth. Shit, sorry.
No worries.
I guess to say that we can't construct a system of truth that doesn't conform to that sort of thing that's just sort of built into our minds. I would say ultimately that you necessarily have to appeal to a normative preference in a sense. But I guess to sort of like move out from that
Hmm.
more broadly, because I'm curious to like what your sort of broader system is of like, you know, epistemology, metaphysics. I can sort of like
It's very
explain.
underdeveloped.
Sure.
I focus on this stuff because it's easiest to understand for me.
Hmm.
My field is not this. My field is,
I'm sorry, your field is what? You cut out.
well, I don't have a field yet technically,
Oh,
but
sure.
I want to be a sociologist. Field of study is like society and stuff like that. It's
Mm.
like
Mm-hmm.
not I am intensely interested in philosophy. It's just very inaccessible.
Sure.
And I don't really learn well by reading things.
Mm.
I learn a lot better by talking to people who know things. The thing I always say is that like if I'm reading a book, I can't ask my book questions.
Yeah, yeah, of course.
I can't get the book to tell me more than what's written on the page.
Mm-hmm.
But I can talk to a professor who will be able to tell me things. And I think once we start going outside of like the very basics, it gets like really hard for me to define certain things like, you know, what is my theory of truth beyond the very basics of like logic.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, it feels really hard. Like, should I take a deflationary approach? Should I take a correspondence approach? I don't know. The justified true belief approach, which has supposedly been refuted by that one thought experiment.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It's interesting,
Okay.
and
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
maybe you can like what is your theory of truth, Mister Malky Infidel?
Sure. So like I guess with regards to what like Vosh and Destiny and perspective I just like with regards to like the drama, I guess.
Hmm.
Um um I think that what I would say is things like we ultimately I am like an ultimate skeptic in a sense in that like I think there's no real way to sort of know that our perception of the world is true. Like I think more or less our understanding of the world comes from a mix of some sort of internal logical processes and then these are sort of mixed with some sort of sense perception. And I think it's since it's technically possible that we could acquire some sense perception where like we are able to perceive contradiction or something like that. I think there's ultimately no way to know that sort of our epistemic system and how we perceive reality is objectively true. However, I think we sort of have to assume that this is the case in order to make any sort of coherent sense in reality. Like, I don't know that the law of non-contradiction is true, but I have to assume that it is true, because if I didn't, like, my entire understanding of the world, how I function in it, would just be thrown into complete chaos. Nothing would make any sense. Like, you can't bite that bullet, right?
Yeah.
And I think like Destiny sort of made the analogy, and I really liked this analogy where he said, like, imagine I ask you, like, who would win in a fight between like Goku and Vegeta. You couldn't just be like, well, neither, because it's fictional, right? Like, maybe it is fictional, but you still have to work within the you still have to sort of work within the laws of the fictional universe in a sense. And that's, I guess, fundamentally what I would like say about reality.
I think I agree. I don't know if I would call it like I don't know if I would call it that, but like I would say that it's true to it corresponds to how we are able to perceive the truth or falsity of things. Now, maybe there is some higher level being that has some higher level logic that's able to see things different than us in the same way that we can create computers that have lower levels of logic than us and can't see the same things that we do.
Mm-hmm.
But assuming that's true, we have no knowledge of them and can't possibly experience things that way.
Mm-hmm.
So our understanding of truth has to necessarily be confined by human perception.
Sure.
And I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
I think that that's fine. And when I say that something is true, I think it's implying that it's confined within that, because that's the only way we have to evaluate it. Since there is no alternative to it, I don't think that it's reasonable to say that we ought to do anything other than what we are doing.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah.
So I would say that, but I mean, is that all that's required for a theory of truth, though? I feel like there's more to it than
I'm
that.
sure there's more to it. Like, I'm not a philosopher, right? I'm just kind of commenting on what my take on like the contention that Vosh and Rem and Destiny seemed to be having.
Yeah, and I feel like you would probably more so land in the Vosh, not the Vosh, the
Destiny.
Rem perspective velocity Destiny camp. Yeah,
Yeah. I don't know if Vosh disagrees with me or not. That's the weird thing. It's like if Vosh is genuinely saying that, like, if Vosh is taking the sort of epistemic anti-realist approach in the sense that we can't know that, like, our perception, we can't know that the sort of fundamental principles that we go by are real, then I would agree. But like, if he's genuinely saying, if Vosh were to genuinely say that he's an epistemic anti-realist in the sense that we don't even have any reason, or we shouldn't even be confined to working within these certain epistemic principles, not only would I disagree with him, I wouldn't believe him. Because like the way that like any sane person lives contradicts that belief. Like, you don't actually think that.
It's what I would say is that it's impossible to actually live that out.
100%, yeah.
Our minds are not able to perceive anything other than that way. Like it's impossible that he actually believes that, basically.
Yeah, it's impossible for anyone to believe that. If someone actually believed that, they wouldn't be able to put together the words to say that they believe that.
Yeah, I don't think that anybody who didn't believe that wouldn't be a moral agent of any kind. Yeah. And because they would have a fundamentally different perception than us. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that that's the case. I think that these are universal to human experience, because we have no reason to suggest otherwise, at least. But I don't know. I think that the way he articulates it, like the example given was like Rem and Bosch were talking about like whether or not you can objectively say the Holocaust happened. And Vosh said that like, oh, you can just construct a theory of truth where that isn't the case and the Holocaust didn't actually happen. And I don't know, that just seems kind of, that seems to me like he's taking the epistemic anti-realist position, because at
Yeah,
that
that
point,
seems like a very untenable thing to think.
yeah. And
To be charitable to Vosh, and I don't think
I'm
that
very charitable to Vosh, I must say.
I think
I people would say I'm overly charitable to
yeah,
what
sure,
Vosh
yeah.
says.
I think that Vosh maybe hasn't completely thought through this because I mean he's not a philosophy bro. He's a
Yes.
political commentator. He's a sociologist, which is fine. I mean that's his area of expertise. I wouldn't expect anybody to just like have some immediate like god tier understanding of like epistemology, right?
Hmm.
But I do think he's like that you can't hold that position. Like to say that you can just to say that you can just like come up with a system where like the Holocaust didn't happen, um, like and it's like equally valid. I think that's very silly.
Yeah, it devolves into contradiction,
It
and
does,
that's,
and you necessarily have to bite a bullet that you just can't bite. Like
yeah,
yeah,
it's impossible to do that while still being confined to human experience.
yeah,
So that's I I wish he would just listen to somebody about this
yeah.
instead of doing what he does. And because this is like the area where I think he needs the most education,
Yeah.
I would say. And his statements about it are incredibly irresponsible in my opinion, and it makes me sad, because
Mhm.
like I try not to develop parasocial relationships. Like I really try to see content creators more like their characters, as opposed to people that I have any sort of connection with. But
Mhm.
sometimes if you just watch somebody enough, it can't really be helped. And I
Yeah.
try to keep my distance, but it still, you kind of fall into those traps, and it makes me sad.
Yeah.
But
For sure.
you know,
Yeah.
not so sad that I would cry about it, but it's
Sure.
still, it's disappointing, I guess is the word that I'm looking for.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know. Uh Okay. I feel like we've just agreed this entire conversation. Do you have like some contention, like some big spicy thing, I don't know, that
Yeah.
we could talk about instead?
I think that your views are absolutely untenable and absurd.
Oh, oh boy. Which ones?
I don't know. It's a good question.
Nice.
What do you
Hold
believe?
on. God, what are my hottest takes?
Good
God,
question.
I get a lot of, I have a lot of hot takes. Hold on. Who's it? Is Alfred's in chat?
Who?
Hey, yes, Alfritz is in chat, and so is Peep and Sheep. They would be more familiar. Alfritz and Peep and Sheep, what's my hottest take? You can type it in the chat, and we can debate it with Mouthy Infidel. Oh, bright mode? Yeah, that's yikes. That's a yikes.
I
I
have
mean, have
dark
fun
mode on my
tearing your
phone,
eyes.
but I don't know how to turn it on in the website.
Oh, it's you don't know how to turn it dark mode on? It's like the dot dot dot. Go to the dot dot dot.
Here?
At the ellipses at the bottom,
Okay.
next to your name.
Okay. Oh god.
Uh, I don't know how delayed the stream
Oh
is.
god. Wait. Okay. I don't know how to do this, okay? We'll figure it out. We'll
Yeah.
figure it out in a bit.
Okay. Uh. Okay.
Oh, what was your
So
take on the Riley Grace Rochon Demon Mama
no
debate?
idea. I have no idea. I haven't watched it. I. 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 I don't know. So I have a weird relationship with some debates where I just like can't watch them because I hate everything that's happening in them.
Sure.
So
It was
I
very
haven't watched it.
painful for me to watch that
Yeah.
debate. I think Riley Grace Rochon is incredibly reasonable. I think Demon Mama is like not. Um,
Well, you have a very biased perspective, but I want to.
I do.
What's generally the arguments made on both sides?
Okay, I'm gonna give you a very like crude interpretation. I think Riley Grace. So they're arguing over fundamentally what it means to be a woman. I think Riley Grace Rochong was essentially making the case that a woman is defined both subjectively and objectively. Subjectively meaning someone's internal thought processes that lead them to express themselves in a certain way, and objectively in the sense that it's the totality of one's gender expressions, how people interpret those expressions, and how your average reasonable person in society would categorize you based on those expressions. So essentially, Riley Grace Rochong was making the take that just identifying as a woman isn't necessarily enough to like make you a woman in the sense of like, being perceived by one as one like broadly in society.
Well, so that's a descriptive claim, though.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
if you identify as a woman, most people won't perceive you as one, but ought they? I think that's
Yeah, and I am positive she takes the position that we ought to move in that direction.
okay.
Yeah, I think she's
Well,
just kind
then,
of making that descriptive claim. And Demon Mama was taking the position that there is no definition of woman because like it's too like I guess fuzzy. Like different people have different ideas of what makes a woman, and so therefore there is no definition of like what makes a woman, which seems like a weird argument to me because it seems like you could only almost say that about literally any definition. Like take
yeah,
like a
there's no,
chair, for example. Like not
yeah,
everybody agrees on like if you asked like a bunch of people to think of a chair in their heads, not everybody would think of the same thing. But like regardless, like we accept that generally there is a universal concept of a chair.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's the one that people always go to,
Yeah.
as is
Hmm.
like a soup or whatever else. But you know, I think that the better thing isn't really to quibble about what is the definition of gender. I think it's way better to just say we ought to redefine gender such that it isn't limited to these certain things,
Hmm.
and we ought to. Well, I mean, I think we ought to not have gender at all,
Hmm.
but
Yeah, I agree.
that's like a very long term
Oh, okay.
thing.
So here's a question that I have. So I used to buy into the gender abolition stuff. I'm starting to question myself to some extent because I agree in the sense that I think gender abolitions should be abolished, right? I don't think
Mhm.
that anybody should be born and then based on the sex organs that they have ascribed certain roles that they are expected to abide by throughout their life. I think that's like pretty fundamentally fucked up, and I think it's like pretty harmful.
Mhm.
However, if we could imagine a society wherein there are like genders, right? Like there are certain categories
I
that
mean,
are
there are genders
generally.
in this society,
Yeah, no,
so
I agree.
that's
I'm saying like it's different though in the sense that there are genders, but like there's no stigma around changing your gender, right? Like you can identify as no gender, you can identify as any gender you want, and you will not get stigmatized to any extent. Nobody will care. Um, I find it hard to see why in that society it would still be like necessary to abolish gender. Um, because
I
yeah, sure. So go ahead.
so for one, it may be the case that that's the most we can ever hope for.
Hmm.
Is one where it's destigmatized, but I think that creating gender categories itself lends to essentialist thinking and bad outcomes. I guess it makes people think in certain ways about people that I don't like.
What ways would you
It's
say?
Well, I don't like thinking of people as, if possible, if we're in a society where things are destigmatized, I don't like thinking of people by these categories. Like, for example, when we talk about race, in a
Hmm.
society that where race was abolished, nobody would even pay attention to the differences between in like melanin content between people, in the same way that most people don't really pay attention to the differences in hair color between people, which isn't to say that nobody does. And there are certain, which is why I say that it might just be that destigmatization is all we can really hope for, because there are still, though they are minor, there are still some stereotypes about people with different hair colors.
Sure.
Like there's like the stereotypes of gingers burning up in the sun, or
Mhm.
blondes being stupid, or whatever, right?
Mhm.
But
But
they are,
the question would be, do you think that we can have different hair colors without having those types of stereotypes? Because that would be sort of like my fundamental argument is I think that I think that like imagine like because you talk about how it sort of lends itself to um essentialist thinking. I think that's kind of true, but I also think like I think there are certain things that people want other people to like consider about them, right? Like if I put on some clothes, I want people to perceive me in these clothes and know, oh, hey, he's like wearing those clothes, obviously, as opposed to like different clothes. Like I don't think we can escape a scenario wherein people adopt certain aspects of like fashion or their personality in order for people to identify those characteristics with them. And I think we could imagine a scenario where gender just sort of becomes one of those things, right? Where
well,
it's like
that's
if,
much
yeah.
easier to imagine than complete abolition of
But
gender.
I'm wondering
I
why it's less preferable, even.
Because I still think that even to the extent that these categories do exist, it can be hurtful. Also, I want to be clear that I think that gender is a little bit different uh from like hair color and stuff, in that gender is still something that's completely abstract. It's not necessarily something that has to be
Hmm.
physical. Like we have ideas about what gender should be, but it's not like it has a correspondence to some real thing in the real world,
Sure.
like
Okay.
a hair color.
I can make a different analogy that like um, more so encapsulates what you're talking about.
Sure.
So let's talk about like being a fan of like a sports team, for example.
Hmm.
I think that a lot of people will, you know, go out, they'll wear their, I want to say the Patriots are a sports team. Um, yeah, I think so. Yeah. So people like go out.
Patriots
That's
are
a
a
football
sports
team.
team.
That's New England, I think. Yeah.
Hmm.
So people will go out, they'll wear their Patriots jerseys, and they'll do it because they want people to associate their character with this sports team or with being a part of this fandom. And they want people to associate with them the characteristics that are associated with that status because people sort of get utility out of categorizing themselves in these certain ways. However, nobody is really like stigmatized. I mean, unless you get into like some really fucking crazy like sports households. Um, Nobody's really like stigmatized. Like if someone's like, "Hey, I like the Patriots," generally speaking, if you're talking to like most sane people, they're not going to be like, "You fucking piece of shit. I'm going to discriminate against you based on that. I'm going to like essentialize your entire character based on that." It's more so just like, "Oh, that's cool. You get some utility out of characterizing yourself in this way. Nobody really thinks less of you because of it." And I'm just wondering, like, if we could get to a point where gender was like that, wouldn't that almost be more preferable as opposed to complete gender abolition if somebody is getting utility out of being a certain, expressing themselves as a certain category that they like to express themselves as, but like you know they're not getting any of the negatives associated with modern gender roles, like people aren't discriminating against them, people aren't stigmatizing them if they decide to change their gender, like that sort of thing.
Okay, so for one, I think this is like a side point
Hmm.
because I know it's not really that important to the analogy, because you could use anything that is super destigmatized, but I think you underestimate the extent to
Sure.
which sports allegiance is really, really stigmatized,
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
especially because like there are certain teams who are seen to be like seen to have bad people, and like support of those teams is seen as like supporting bad institutions or whatever.
Hmm.
And there's also a lot of the fact that like sports allegiance is really, really closely tied to like nationalism or like
Mm-hmm.
uh identification with a certain place as opposed to like just that team.
Mm-hmm.
Like people think of their sports teams as making their state or area proud as opposed to them
Yeah,
as
sure.
opposed
We
to
could we
just
could
the
imagine
success of
some
them.
other category,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
That yeah.
I'm just pointing that out because like it's just in case somebody in the future you ever use this analogy, somebody in the future might quibble over that, and it's like I you know
Mm-hmm.
it
Sure, sure.
irrespective of that.
I'll keep that in mind.
Yeah. Um, when it comes to, I don't think that it's hard to say because they might be deriving utility from it, but they're only deriving utility from it in reference to the society that they're in. And the question becomes, would they feel differently were they in a different society where that wasn't the case? And would that society have more overall utility as a result of them not having to feel like they need to conform to certain roles? Like the thing is that if you have like a gender category, there are going to be some people who get purist about it. Are there not? Like there will be some people who say this gender category, you need to do X, Y, or Z. And maybe it's not like super duper like socially enforced or whatever, but there would still be those pressures sometimes. And I think that that's why we should our long-term ideal should be the abolition of gender entirely as opposed to just the destigmatization of it. And again, I
Yeah.
don't know if it's necessarily possible for that. And I also like to ask for more than I expect to get, generally speaking.
Mm.
Like if we ask for the abolition of gender, people are more likely to try to overcompensate, and then we might actually get something that approximates gender destigmatization.
Mm-hmm.
But um, if that's all we get to, that'll be a much better society. I don't think that it's perfect, but I don't really expect anything to be perfect. And it's it's just a process, I guess. Is that I don't think that it should be I think that it should be seen as like something that we should strive for, even if it's not something we necessarily always fulfill exactly. Does that
Mm-hmm.
make sense?
Sure. Yeah, so I would say I am tempted to agree with your point that if we have sort of these gender categories that that like there will be some instances where people essentialize that and maybe make someone feel like shit for not living up to the gender that they choose to categorize themselves as.
Oh, you know
um
what a good example of this actually
mhm,
is astrology.
mm,
Because some people really essentialize based on astrology. And
sure.
there are, I would say most people kind of just see it as like a silly thing, but there are some people just as a result of it being something that categorizes humans,
Hmm.
it some people really go hard on the essentializing part of it.
Yeah, so
And
what
I
I would
think that
say.
that's
Mhm.
inherent to categorization is my point.
I'm not sure if that's inherent to categorization. I think maybe to some degree of it is. I would say that in terms of astrology, I think astrology is almost like more essentialized by nature in that it's like you're born in this month, so these are all of the character traits you have to have. Whereas if you imagine like a completely, I guess you could call it gender optional society, gender ideally wouldn't be essentialized to that extent.
It
But
wouldn't be to that extent, but I
sure,
think there would still be people who did
sure.
essentialize in their own
Yeah,
way.
maybe some people. Yeah, I think what it ultimately comes down to is whether or not the utility certain people derive from categorizing themselves in a certain gendered way would outweigh the negative utility of certain isolated incidents where people where certain people like essentialize people based on their gender. And ultimately, I don't know if there's an answer to that question, especially
It,
since we live in a world where we're so far removed from any from a scenario where either of the two things we're talking about have like come to fruition.
I mean,
Um,
I guess you could call this like gender realism or
sure.
whatever. Like
Hmm.
we can't. It's hard to imagine a society without gender when we live in one that
Yeah, yeah.
has gender. So it conceptually to me, like, and again, this could just be totally wrong, but my feeling is that people being wouldn't necessarily have I think that people would still benefit from the ability to express themselves, even if that self-expression wasn't part of a group identity like gender. And that's how I feel. Now, I could be totally wrong. I would there should be I'm sure there's psychological literature on it, but
Yeah.
that's just the feeling that I get, and I think that it's what we should strive for now. And if it's not, if it never comes to fruition or it ends up being a worse society as a result, then it's not like it would be impossible to go back.
Hmm.
It's like I think that ultimately it's what we should be aiming for, even if it's not what we end up getting.
Okay, so what I would say like two things about that.
Hmm.
First, I think that I definitely think there is some psychological benefit to identifying with a certain category. Um, and as long as we're minimizing the detriments of the existence of these categories by, making sure that, which category you ascribe to is optional, you're not going to be, discriminated against in any sense because you adopt one of these categories. As long as we're doing that, it seems like the damage is pretty minimal. And I think that is in terms of like, should we be asking for more than should we be asking for like the best thing that we can get? Um, True splish. Um, I think that we should be asking for the most radical change that we can get within the bounds of like what the empirical evidence would suggest or like logic would suggest is plausible. More so like empirical evidence, I guess. A lot of these things can be way too hard to like logically derive at a conclusion or logically arrive at a
Well,
conclusion on.
so
So
then
like I would think like I'm not sure that the benefits of just completely destroying these categories in terms of like we have less isolated incidents of essentialization would outweigh the benefits of like people being able to categorize themselves in certain ways that brings them some utility. So I'm not sure about whether or not this is something that we should be pushing for like right now. Um, yeah.
maybe not, but I mean, what I want to do is create a society where this stuff can sort itself out, I guess.
Hmm.
Like, ideally, people will trend towards things if they have the ability to do so. They will generally go for things that make them happy.
Hmm.
So if we come to a society where this ends up being where like this stops happening, or like where people are more free to express themselves, and it ends up being the case that people get some added benefit from identifying with a group, then you know what? I'm okay with that.
Hmm.
I would consider that a much better world than we have right now. And I am open to the idea that I'm wrong. And I think it's just a matter of getting to the point where we could let that experiment play out
Hmm.
by itself
Yeah, sure.
without interference. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure.
I don't know if that's like Weasley or
No, no,
whatever,
I,
but
I, I understand what you mean. Yeah.
it's that's just that's a lot of the stuff. Is that it's hard to know from where you are how stuff in the future will be.
Hmm.
Like, which is why like empirical arguments can be so hard as well, because you know some things sound great and then turn out not to be great, and then some things sound terrible and turn out to be good. and then there's like this whole continuum between those two. And I don't know, it's you just kind of have to try things as you go, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And which is why I'm very cautious, I would say, like a lot more cautious than a lot of people are, because I have anxiety, so I
Sure.
am always unsure about myself.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel very uncomfortable prescribing steps past the first few. And I like having ideals that we should strive for, because again, I think it's good to ask for more than you think you can get. But
Mm.
I feel like at the same time, you should always be open to the possibility that you need to do something else.
Yeah,
And I think a lot of people are not open to that.
I would say that I would say that in terms of like what we should be asking for relative to what we think can be achieved, um, I would say that like we should be asking for more than what we think we can achieve, to the extent that the more that to the extent that the more than we can achieve part is actually something that we are confident is desirable. So like when someone's negotiating like a wage, it's very common that they'll be like, "Hey, why don't you give me a, I don't know, $50 or a $40 wage per hour," when what they're actually shooting for or hoping for is like 30, or something
Mm-hmm.
like that. Um, and the reason that works, and the reason that I think that makes sense, is because they actually would like, a $50 wage. But
Yeah.
I don't know if the same logic works if you're asking for more than you think you can achieve just because it's more than what you think you can achieve, even if, if you actually did achieve that, you like it wouldn't be a good thing. I wouldn't say that that's like a good idea, I guess, because like, then
So
if
do
you
you
do achieve it eventually, like you're kind of fucked. It just kind of confuses everything. I think it's very clear to have, or I think it's very beneficial to make sure that your goals are clear and that like the only things you're saying that you want are things that you actually think are desirable.
so I guess, to what extent do you have to justify what you want? Because there are plenty of good ideas that were like fought for. Like, when I mean, as imperfect as it was, the United States fought to be its own independent nation that
Mm-hmm.
was democratic, right? And I think that, between the very flawed democracy of the United States and the absolute monarchy of, well, not the absolute monarchy, the constitutional monarchy of the British, I would choose to side with the Americans, because I would think that that's more in line with what I would want to see. But they didn't really have empirical evidence to suggest that democracy was a good idea. There were like some historical examples of democracies, but said historical examples were seen to be like impotent and not very effective. So like they called it like the Great American Experiment or whatever.
Yeah.
And so to what extent are societies allowed to do that, I guess? Because if we only go by data, that would never be able to
Mm-hmm.
happen,
Yeah.
right? So
So,
there has to be
mhm.
something outside of what the data suggests, correct? Or what the
Yeah,
data
I
suggests.
definitely agree. So one phrase that's often used that I've used in the past is that we need like policy, we need evidence-based policy, but we also need policy-based evidence. Um, and so like I guess my position on communism would be like a good example of this. I think that communism, like a, stateless, classless, moneyless planned society, is desirable to the extent that it's possible. Now, whether or not it is possible, or it would be functional or it would work well, is currently an open empirical question. And so my general position is we should go as far left as the evidence would currently suggest as possible. And then from there, we can experiment with, we could sort of gradually experiment with, maybe plan this industry, maybe plan that industry, see what works. And if the evidence suggests that we can continue going in this direction, then, great. But my problem is when we start talking about making, so I'm fine with gradually like moving in a certain direction, seeing how far we can go and sort of adjusting based on that. I guess what I start to take issue with is the idea that we should start making these massive paradigm shifts without any evidence to suggest that this would be functional. And I don't know if and another thing that I would take issue with, and I think that the gender abolition thing probably falls more under this category than the last category I talked about. The other thing that I sort of take issue with is when we start talking about things that might be harmful from a rhetorical perspective, when I'm not clear on what would be the value of even achieving that thing. So yeah, I guess that would be it.
I guess I mean, that's fair to think about, as since you're like a public figure and you probably, or more of a public figure than I am, for example, and you need to think about that. But as the geometry dash people in this chat will know, I very rarely take into consideration how I sound to other people.
Sure.
And I get clipped a lot as a result. Not audio usually, but usually like other stuff. Like, so I don't know. It's really hard for me to care, and I know I should. And if I ever become a public figure, maybe I will. But it's really hard for me to care because it feels to me like if I wanted to convince people of things, why wouldn't I just do propaganda? Why even like why why ask for what I really want instead of other things? Why not just become like a propagandist who is truthful, but only to the extent that I need to be in order to sell my political messaging, and I don't go as far as I like actually want
Yeah,
them to.
I don't like to think that what I'm doing isn't necessarily that. Like if I have something that's like a that I genuinely believe is like a good idea, I wouldn't say like, no, I don't think this is a good idea, like just for optics purposes. I guess when we get into the territory of like, I'm not convinced what doing this thing would achieve, or like that we couldn't just achieve through like other measures. I'm not even convinced that like doing this thing would create like net positive utility as opposed to other more easier things we could push for. I don't know why I would say like, hey, I believe in like gender abolition, which is going to be like an immediate turnoff to most people. When if they were like, well, why? I could be like, well, there's a chance, but I'm not really sure that it could be better than just having, destigmatized gender categories. Like, I don't know. I just feel like the utility doesn't like work out in that way.
I mean, what that seems to me is that it seems like you're not advocating for a position that you don't fully believe
Yeah,
in,
yeah, yeah.
though. That's all that really sounds to me. That doesn't really seem like a rhetorical choice at all.
Well, I
That
think like the rhetorical thing is kind of just like an added negative.
I guess.
Yeah.
I'm very used to pushing for positions that I feel are very correct,
Mm-hmm.
but that nobody ever really wants to listen to because they are complete poison. Like like the Destiny incest debate, for example.
Sure.
Like that's complete poison to anybody who touches it.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I firmly believe, I fully agree with Destiny. I did before I even discovered Destiny.
Mm-hmm.
Like I agreed with that position, but most people aren't willing to listen to that. But I'm still gonna push for it anyway because that's what I truly believe, and I feel like it's more important to be authentic to myself than it is to waffle on positions that I fully believe in.
Mm-hmm.
Because authenticity is how I like to live. I like to be as authentic and real as possible,
Mm-hmm.
to the point where I like don't lie to people. I don't like I don't know. I don't even really tell white lies. It
Sure.
makes me uncomfortable. I don't know. This is a window into my psychology and
Sure.
not really useful for most people, but
Mouthy therapist, Fidel.
exactly. God. I don't know. That's a sure. Okay. I feel like we've exhausted gender abolitionism. I still have energy to keep going if you want some like real hot takes.
Sure.
Uh if you want me to leave I can though. It's like it's not really my
Oh, if you have anything else, go for it.
okay. Okay. Wait, okay. Alfritz, are you still here? Please. What is my what do you think what take of mine do you think that Mouthy will find most disagreeable? Come on. Come on. I have so many hot takes, man. You got to know at least one, right? Hmm. Or sheep, peep and sheep, because I know that you. Ooh. Oh wait,
Fuck it.
I have one.
I don't care.
How do you
Yeah, go
feel
for it.
about How do you feel about do you think suicide is a right?
Mm, okay, I think the correct question, the way that I interpret the question, is suicide a right? Is ought suicide be a right? Um,
Yeah, well, obviously,
yeah, sure,
because
sure, yeah. I just, yeah, sure. I always get into like weird territory sometimes when I'm talking to like a conservative and they say like, well, healthcare isn't a right because a right is defined as this, and it's like, well, you're missing like the question.
yeah.
Um,
I when I say, do you think suicide should be a right
mhm.
for all people?
Um, no, I don't think so.
In what cases should it be, and what cases should it not be?
I think suicide. I'm trying to think of this in like a consistent way because like my first reaction would be like suicide should be a right in cases where you're living like where you're like deathly ill, you know,
Hmm.
and you just like in extreme amounts of pain, like physically, and like then it should be legal, but in other cases maybe not. But I fail to see how I could make that argument and then also simultaneously make the argument that somebody who's like mentally ill, who's similarly living in excruciating pain, like shouldn't be able to kill themselves. Um, I don't know. That's a question. That's a good question. I so one argument that I could see is like if someone is like dying and they have like a year left to live, and that year is going to be like nothing but excruciating pain and suffering, then like we have a window of time of how long we know they're going to live. We know that the quality of that life is going to be extremely low. So it's okay to let them kill themselves. However, if we just have somebody who's like in their 20s or even in their 60s or something, and they're like extremely depressed, um, then I don't think we could say the same thing because it's like, well, no, if you didn't kill yourself, you could like live an entire like rest of your life. We don't know that you're going to be living in extreme suffering because there's always the possibility that you get better later. And I think helping people to get better, I guess, make their lives better, make their mental state healthier, is the kind of institutions that we as a society should be trying to propagate. Um, so I guess yeah, that would be my response. I could also see an interesting argument of like you could conceptualize your future selves as different people who you don't have the moral right to kill, but that's like some really weird territory. Like I don't even know like yeah, I
Yeah,
wouldn't even know like how to navigate that sort of field.
I mean that would also imply that it's not right to get a tattoo because
Hmm.
your future self can't consent to getting a tattoo
Yeah, that's fair.
or any permanent thing that you
Yeah,
would do to
yeah,
your
that's
body.
fair. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but regardless, okay. So I guess here's a question: do you think it's possible to be rational, like a rational individual, and also to want to commit suicide?
It depends on the circumstance.
I would okay. So I would agree with that because there are very. I think that there are very obvious examples where people who are rational and of a sound mind are able to bring themselves to suicide because of some circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess like the example that I always give is like the soldier who takes a cyanide pill in order to avoid torture at the hands of the enemy, right? That's
Yeah.
rationally like you can weigh one way or the other whether or not you think that would be a good choice. Like I am afraid of death. I would never ever consciously choose to take my life
Mm-hmm.
when I feel like I have a chance of making it out. But irrespective of that, I wouldn't think it would be irrational for somebody to prefer a quick death over like a
Yeah.
bunch of suffering and pain. That
Yeah.
wouldn't be irrational in my opinion.
So I
But
would agree, but I would so I would agree in the case of like a soldier, and I would agree in the case of like somebody who's like actively dying. When it comes to like somebody who has depression, I would always think that like killing yourself is the wrong thing to do. Almost in every case. Because I'm
I
generally of the
agree with that.
belief that like if you feel the need to commit suicide, obviously, I don't think that's just a fact of the world that you ought to kill yourself or a correct conclusion. I think that's indicative of some internal problem to you, right? Like, obviously, it can't be the case that humans are wired to want to kill themselves. That wouldn't make any evolutionary sense. So, like, if you have the desire to kill yourself, then there's some internal problem that you're having. And the solution to that is to identify that problem and work on fixing it. Because if you kill yourself, well, you're depriving yourself of the ability to address the underlying issue and then experience all kinds of like cool, meaningful shit for the rest of your life.
Okay. So I would say a couple things. So for one, I think it's a little bit iffy to say that it's always an internal problem because I think depression can be caused by external things
Sure.
and
Okay.
external
So
events.
that's true. Like, let's say someone develops depression because, um, would you make this argument for antinatalism? Yeah, I think I would. Um, so it's true that like depression can be spurred on by external events, but at the end of the day, it's sort of how your internal, how you internally are processing those events, right?
Sure. I
Mm-hmm.
think that there are certain events that most people, when subjected to them, would prefer death over
Yeah.
the alternative. And so here's the thing that I'm going to get to is that I think that you would really have to lean into the conceptualization of depression as a disease that fundamentally changes how your mind works.
Mm-hmm.
So the way that I would justify this to myself is that if I see somebody who's having a heart attack, I wouldn't think twice about saving them from that heart attack had I the means to do so, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that seems like the morally correct thing to do. And to me, I feel like depression conceptualized as a mental illness is kind of similar
Mm-hmm.
because if you have depression, the mental illness, then you are being influenced to do things that you would otherwise not do.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the depression it's not yourself that's killing you, more so it's the depression that is killing you.
Yes.
The thing is, though, is that I think it's possible to be of sound mind, like to not be depressed and also want to kill yourself. Now, the actual way of implementing this policy wise would be really difficult. But I think that in general, it's probably okay. Like if you see somebody about to kill themselves, it's probably okay to assume that they're not of sound mind just because the outcomes of that, like, it would be really hard to just say that outcomes would be better if you just never stopped anybody from committing suicide, right? So
Mm-hmm.
in situations where you see that happening, it feels like that should be an automatic I should help this person. Even if it turns out later that they were of sound mind while doing it, it you shouldn't have to take that risk because you
Mhm.
can't tell from the outside. The
Yeah,
thing
and
is, though,
and I
is
would say
that,
that it would be justified to stop people who are of sound mind from killing themselves.
well,
Well,
see,
it depends
that's
on
the
what you
thing.
mean by sound mind, really, because I would say that if you have the desire to kill yourself, um, you might be sound mind in the case that you don't have any diagnosable mental illnesses, but I would still say that there is some defect there, in the sense that this cannot be the natural state of human cognition because it wouldn't make evolutionary sense, and B, you are still, even if you don't have a mental illness, to say that I ought to kill myself, I think would be a incorrect statement.
So,
Because I think that it's like just from a utility standpoint, if I have the understanding of like I want to maximize my personal utility, I think someone coming to the conclusion that I ought to kill myself in the kinds of scenarios that we're talking about is almost always going to be an incorrect conclusion from that framework.
um, I don't think so. There are a couple questions in
Okay,
that
wait.
case.
So
So,
can I like expand
yeah,
on this a little bit further? Um,
go for it.
I think it's technically possible to imagine a scenario where if we look at it, we could say, like, if we look at it from like a bird's eye view, right, where we can tell the future, it's possible that there is a scenario where there's a person who, like, if they didn't decide to kill themselves, would never be happy, and their negative utility that they experience from the suffering of life would outweigh, like, that would justify killing themselves. However, like that's technically possible. I think in the overwhelming amount of scenarios, like that's not going to be the case. I think this is a highly fantastical scenario. But as a rule utilitarian, I'm trying to like construct general rules that, like, when universalized, lead to the best outcomes. And I think that saying like you shouldn't kill yourself, we shouldn't let you kill yourself, barring some situation of like you're dying from an illness or something, I think that this is like justifiable from a real utilitarian framework, I guess.
Okay. So, hmm. So I guess the question I was going to ask is like, is it your right to decide if people will have a if people will have negative utility in the future as a result?
Um,
Because I think that there are situations where it's absolutely the case that most people will have negative utility in the future as a result of them doing an action, but it's still not our right to decide whether or not they should do that. For example, smoking. I think it's demonstrably the case that most people who smoke have negative side effects as a result of them smoking. But I don't think that it's then right to say that no, that people shouldn't smoke, right?
I would disagree with that. Personally, I'm not in favor of making smoking illegal, but
Okay, wait, wait, wait,
mhm,
wait. I will clarify then.
sure,
I will say that I when I'm talking about that, I was mixing up like I'm mixing up morals and like
legals, yeah, sure,
what our approach to policy should be.
sure.
Like I think that ultimately it is the case that if you smoke, it's probably not a good thing in the
Hmm.
sense that it is bad for you and you should probably not be doing it.
Hmm.
However, I think that the negative utility of having an entity that's capable of stopping you from doing that is worse. Like that's a worse outcome than not.
I will
Like
be. I have a response to that. I will be right back. Okay.
okay, go for it. So, mouthy infidels chat. How are you guys doing today? Uh you can follow me on Twitter. Uh I'm going to get my Twitter and where you guys can follow me and listen to all my hot takes about politics and the occasional video game. Link it in chat. You should all go follow this. I have much better takes than Mouthy Infidel. I will have you all know that this is just factually correct. If there ever were an objective truth, it's the fact that my Twitter has better takes on it than Mouthy Infidels.
Okay.
Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you now.
Nice.
Welcome back.
Welcome.
All right. So
Okay.
you said you had you said you had a response to this?
Yeah, so in terms of whether or not the negative utility of having an entity that can prevent you from doing a certain thing to yourself, in terms of whether that that negative utility would outweigh the positive utility of I guess not engaging in that action. I think it's entirely dependent on what the action is, what the entity that's capable of stopping you is, how that entity functions, and a lot of different things. So in the case of cigarettes, right, I am not in favor of making cigarettes illegal. I'm in favor of full decriminalization of all drugs. But the reason for that isn't because I have some moral appeal where I'm like, I don't think the state should have the right to prevent people from doing drugs. The reasoning for that is that it seems like empirically, having a situation where drugs are decriminalized and we spend the energy into like rehabilitation and these kinds of things, that is the best way to create a scenario where people aren't using dangerous drugs. In the case of suicide, I don't know if there is a parallel argument that you could make to the effect of like somehow making suicide legal would actually limit the amount of suicide or something like that. So yeah, I guess that's what I'd say there.
I mean, there are examples of this because you can't really make suicide illegal per se, because that leads to terrible outcomes where people who fail suicide attempts are then punished under the law.
So I would say that like,
and I'm not saying you're in favor of that. I'm just
Mhm.
saying that that's
Yeah.
sometimes what has happened before in some places, and I think that I would hope that we would both want to avoid something
I
like
would
that.
definitely want to avoid that. I would say illegal in the sense that, like, obviously don't arrest somebody who tried to commit suicide after it failed. But I would say, like, illegal in the sense that the state has the right to prevent you from, you know, if they walk into a building, you're hanging yourself from a noose, they have the right to take you down from that noose.
So here's the thing: is that I would say that too, but I would say that that's because you can't know if that person is of sound mind when they did it, and not because of any
Why do you think
other
that
reason.
why do you think that suicide would be justified in a scenario, or not preventing suicide? Like, say we had a situation where we know someone is of sound mind. Why would it be okay to let that person kill themselves, but not someone who isn't of sound mind?
The reason is because I try to take things from like the God's eye view, where I want to construct a society where where certain things are. This is hard to explain, but like I think that your argument about drugs earlier is very much the case. Like, it's very much the case that decriminalization, legalization, taxation, regulation, all that kind of stuff, that's ultimately good for drug users in the long run because it leads to fewer deaths, better outcomes. But I think that there's also an argument to be made beyond that, where a state or entity that's powerful enough to enforce individual act of taking drugs, like if a state is powerful enough to do that, I think that that automatically makes it such that it will do other things or has the potential to do other things. Like, because if you really want to, you could conceptualize some like complete autocracy where all the people at the top make all the best possible decisions for utility.
Mm-hmm.
The difference is that we know that such a system wouldn't have those people at the top. It would have people who are corrupt, powerful, like who are corrupted by power and would use that power um, badly because of the incentive structures that are in place, right? So I think that what I'm saying here is that if you have a state or entity that's powerful enough to stop you from doing drugs, I think that that would necessarily lead it being powerful enough to do other things that I would consider bad. Does that make sense?
Sure. Um, but I don't know if I agree with that. I think that in terms of if we're crafting legislation, I think that
Wait, wait,
the
wait.
Mhm.
Can I just say that
Yeah.
this is like an ideal world kind of thing? It's not necessarily how I would approach like current day politics because the reality is that we have a state. So I wouldn't um advocate for like non-statist politics as a solution to like something that can be done within the purview of the state.
Hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, can I
So
just wait really quickly?
yeah.
Like this isn't relevant. I just have to address someone in chat. Somebody said, "Hey, Mouthy, why did you say criticizing Israel and is page one in the Nazi playbook?" I didn't say that. You are a stupid fuck. What I said is that disingenuously criticizing Israel as a means to attack Jews is often page one in the Nazi playbook. If like I'm just correct about this. If you've ever watched a debate with any fucking Nazi, whether that be like Eric Stryker, Mike Enoch, whoever the fuck, all the fucking time. These people cannot wait to bring up Israel. Fucking Mike Enoch and Destiny had a fucking debate where they were talking about like whether or not white people are oppressed. And one of the first things Mike Enoch did was bring up fucking Israel, right? Like Nazis cannot wait to fucking do this because they get to sort of use it as a fucking Trojan horse. I'm just correct. You're a stupid fuck, and I'm blocking you. Wait, fuck. How do I do that?
Yeah.
Anyways, sorry. What were you saying?
You are absolutely correct, by the way, about that. Criticism of Israel is great, but it should be legitimate criticism and not disingenuous criticism.
True.
It should be based in real things that are happening and not uh, the white nationalist conceptions of those kinds of things.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Oh,
Yeah.
but anyways, like back to what we were talking about. Um, I would say that I would say that like I sort of agree, but I don't know. I feel like in an ideal world, like this state would have a lot of different functions from providing healthcare to nationalizing this industry or that industry, providing this, a variety of different welfare services, administering a lot of different taxes.
Wait. Can
Mhm.
I ask? What
Yeah.
do you define as the state? Because
Just a like a
the I
monopoly on violence. Yeah.
okay, yes. So that's the definition that I use as well as I use the Weber definition, the
Yeah. Yeah. Sure.
monopoly over of physical force in a given territory. So I guess this might just be a fundamental disagreement with you, but like my politics involves the like inherent skepticism of and eventual disillusionment of the state because I don't think that it's good for violence or legitimate violence to be centralized in any one authority. I think that that leads to bad outcomes and bad incentive structures. So I would I would I think that if you believe that the state is like a necessary component of something,
Hmm.
then sure, that would be that you would then argue about degrees to which the state can have power. But I think that if I don't believe in the state or institutions, and I only believe in like decentralized democratic institutions, then I would have to quibble more over
Yeah.
specific things that they're able to do because I don't want to give them so much power that they would turn into mini states or states in all but name, right?
Sure.
that make
Yeah.
sense?
So I think we're just gonna have like a fundamental disagreement here. Because I do think that a sort of monopoly on violence in the form of a state is like fundamentally a good idea. Um,
Why?
but oh, okay. Do you want to get into this?
I sure, why not?
Sure.
Because it's a very theoretical discussion, and it's like hard not to conceive of a society with a state in
Mm-hmm.
it. Like stateless societies haven't existed to my knowledge. There have been like attempts at like anarchist organization, but there's still ultimately some conception of the state within them.
Mm-hmm.
So so I'm I will say that it doesn't really have much to do with my application
Mm-hmm.
of policy, because I recognize that the state, if it ever will be gotten rid of, is not going to happen now or soon.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm willing to compromise on that.
Mm-hmm.
But fundamentally, I don't think it's good, or I don't think it creates a good incentive structure when there is one institution with the only monopoly on the legitimate use of force. Because I think that that itself creates the potential for abuse.
Yeah.
And I think that, and then the question would become like, well, maybe more abuse could be done if there wasn't a state. But I don't necessarily think that's true. I think that if institutions are democratic enough, violence can be a decentralized force
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to a centralized force, and then
Sure.
it,
But
yeah,
okay, so I do have to get off like pretty
okay,
soon.
that's
Um,
totally fine. It's 1 in the morning for
yeah, yeah,
me,
yeah,
so
me
it's
too.
not
Yeah.
exact.
Yeah. But
uh,
so the one
where do you
thing that
live by chance?
I don't want to dox myself on stream, but
All right, fair enough.
yeah,
I live on the east coast of the United States,
got
but
you. Yeah.
fair enough.
So anyways, yeah, I guess is like the last thing I'll say, then I gotta hop off. Um, I would say that the reason that I believe in a state is because I agree with everything that you said. Like, it is fundamentally different to have a central like thing that can, um, that can like, um, sort of be the sole use of force in society, I guess, put it crudely. But I think
Hmm.
there are obvious benefits to that too. So like if we were to imagine a situation where like let's say we have like a bunch of decentralized communes, one commune is on like I don't know an oil well or something like that and like is polluting the environment, like that commune would obviously have an incentive to continue like I guess to continue to producing oil. The rest of the communes are like, well, you're fucking our environment, so like you have to stop. The other commune is like, no. It seems like the obvious like solution to that problem under this sort of like hyper decentralized system is like war or something like that, or you just have to allow the environment to like continue to be polluted. Which is obviously like kind of fucked up, but those are like the only two solutions like fundamentally. Um, Whereas like in a highly federalized society where like all the states have like a like a central government, it just seems much more efficient in the sense that like, hey, this state is very dependent on oil, but it doesn't matter because like we're all the same country, we all have the same economy, we can just allocate you some money and just ban the use of oil, and like there's nothing you can do about it. It's a federal decision, it's like an open and shut case. It just seems like a much more like efficient way of like going about things, and like in that respect.
So
um
I'll say that I
mhm,
don't think that it's necessarily a bad thing to have large overarching structures, so long as those overarching structures are fundamentally rooted in the lower structures. Like I don't know if you know what liquid democracy is,
mhm,
but I'm a big fan of that
sure.
in specific. And I'm a big fan of like direct accountability. Like I think that elected officials should be there as managers,
Mhm,
not as people who uh dictate policy. I think policy should be dictated by the people that are affected by said policy,
mhm.
or the people I guess who care about it, which is just to be clear, do you know what liquid democracy is?
Yeah, I'm roughly familiar with it. Yeah.
Okay. So um it essentially allows people to vote on the things that they care about and
Mhm,
not on the things that they don't care about, without really fearing that their vote will go to waste because they can just give it to somebody else,
mhm,
is essentially how it works. And so what I would ideally want is for institutions that exist to have elected like managers of certain things, but for their agendas not to be chosen by them, but to instead be voted on by the people that actually care about them.
Sure.
And I don't think that those large institutions necessarily need to be states. I don't
Mm-hmm.
think that they need to have a monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force. And you say, like, if somebody wanted to, there would just be like war. But I don't think, like, if they hold no actual real power, like if these elected managers don't actually hold any real power and are directly accountable to people, then I think that would go a long way to make that less likely, or to make like one commune just screwing over everybody else much less likely, because they would still ultimately be directly accountable to people.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't want to get this is like really far future theoretical stuff, which I know is like not stuff that you super like. I I um
Mm-hmm.
I'm very, I guess I'll end by saying I'm really interested in how power structures affect people,
Sure.
which is probably what I'm going to study when I get into university. Is I'm going to try to focus my studies on how do hierarchies cause people to act. What are like the positives and negatives of them?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that there's a lot of stuff that goes unstudied with respect to them, and
Mm-hmm.
it would be nice to know more.
Yeah.
So by then maybe I'll have a completely different opinion
Yeah.
on
Sure.
which hierarchies are useful or whatever.
Yeah.
So,
Um.
oh, you're highlighting Sierra's comment. That's very
Yeah.
funny.
Um.
Um,
Anyways, yeah.
okay,
I can understand
I
what you're
will.
saying. I do have thoughts on that, but I
Yes, of course.
unfortunately I have to go to bed. I'm very tired.
Yep. But you know what, Mouthy Infidel, this
Mm-hmm.
was a great conversation, and I
Yeah, it was fun.
appreciate it.
I appreciate
I
it. Let's chat again sometime.
Yes, of course. I will be active here
Thanks.
probably. And
Amazing. You better.
I I like you as a person. You are cool
Thanks,
because you
bud.
listen and have a good thought process.
I
The
appreciate it.
thought processes are important,
I agree.
more so than agreeing with me,
True.
honestly. But yeah, that's probably something I just picked up from Destiny as well. But
Yeah, yeah.
it's really just true. I can't stand some people who agree with me. They
Yeah.
when they just have broken thought processes.
Yeah,
Anyway,
yeah.
I'm gonna go now.
All right. See you later, buddy.
Buddy, I love you very much. Goodbye.
Love you too, buddy. Take care.